So just to give you a overview of what I'll talk about, first I'll just give a little bit of a background about sleep. So what is it? Why do we do it? What does healthy sleep actually look like? And then I'll talk more specifically about sleep in kids and then kids in Montana as well, based on some research we've done at MSU in my lab. And then I'll talk a little bit about some signs of insufficient sleep. Again, sometimes it might be if you have a kid who's like falling asleep in class or at school, it might be kind of apparent that sleep is a problem. But sometimes it doesn't show up in that way, and there might be other signs instead. And so we can talk through what that looks like. And then I'll talk a little bit about some ways to promote healthy sleep for youth. And then I also have a handful of different resources for people as well that you guys can take with you. So just to start off, so I'll just do like a pretty informal poll. So just kind of, you don't, I don't know if I can see everybody to see if people raise their hands or not, but just kind of think through like if you've ever said these things or thought these things or heard other people say them. So I'll catch up on my sleep this weekend. Sometimes I watch TV or look at my phone to help myself relax so I can fall asleep. I've learned how to function just fine on less sleep. I can just take a nap to make up for not sleeping well last night. So these are all things that if you haven't said yourself, which many of us probably have, I know I've said some of these, even being a sleep researcher, but certainly things that we've probably heard others say as well. And as you can imagine, a lot of these aren't necessarily conducive to good sleep. They might help maybe in the short run, but can create some issues in the long run too. I'm seeing some like yeses in the chat. So in terms of what sleep is, so one thing just to note is it's not just a time of like just rest or inactivity. I think that's a big misconception sometimes that it's just kind of a time where we turn off and recharge. And it certainly is restorative in a lot of ways. But this idea that it's just like everything kind of shuts down actually couldn't be farther from the truth. And what we see actually is that there's actually quite a bit happening while we're sleeping. So every single organ system in the body is active while we're sleeping.
Oh, hi, Sierra. Thanks
Um,
for calling me back. How are you?
and then, even during some stages when some systems are slowing down, like as we ease into sleep, like our heart rate starts to slow, our breathing starts to slow. But if we look at things like brain activity, there's some parts of our sleep throughout the night where our brain is just as active, if not more active, than when we're awake. So there's actually quite a bit happening while we're sleeping. And you also couldn't live longer without sleep than you could without food. So it's something that's critical to our survival. And if you just look at like the sheer number of hours we spend sleeping, for the average person, this works out to be about a third of your life that you'll spend asleep. So about 122 days a year. For kids, because kids tend to sleep more than we do as adults, that works out to be about 7 years by the time they turn 18. So a really, really big chunk of time is being spent sleeping. And so this is a quote that I love. So just kind of based on like the sheer amount of time that we spend asleep, if this doesn't serve some sort of absolutely vital function, then it's kind of a really big mistake of like the evolutionary process. It'd be such a waste of time if it didn't serve some sort of purpose. So there's a lot of different theories for like why we actually sleep. So what is the purpose of it? Why do we spend so much time doing it? There's a lot of theories that kind of focus around just like because we are physically more inactive, maybe there's some energy conservation that's involved, and there's some support for that. We burn fewer calories when we're asleep than when we're awake, although it's not that different. So potentially there's some of this conservation, but that doesn't seem to explain the whole picture. But we do know that this helps us kind of restore our cognitive function or our brain function or neural function. It's also a time where we can kind of like things like growth hormones are released when we're sleeping, which might be especially critical for kids during certain periods of development. It's a time where our immune system is kind of in overdrive, helping us repair from anything we need to repair from. And we know there's a lot of neural organization and growth happening during this time. So there's studies showing that how kids are sleeping predicts things like their brain development during like the middle school and high school years. And so we think that it's not necessarily like one specific purpose We don't think that sleep, it just does one thing for us. We think that really it's contributing to a lot of different systems in our body. And what we see is like almost every single aspect of our daytime functioning seems to be impacted when we're not getting the right type of sleep. And we'll talk a little bit more about specifically what those daytime consequences can be. So, just to give some basics on sleep and what it is. So, just to give some background, there's really two kind of driving forces that determine when we sleep and when we're awake. Um, the first one has to do with what we call like homeostatic regulation or like sleep pressure. And then the other one has to do with our circadian rhythms. And so I'll talk a little bit more about both of those. So this homeostatic sleep pressure, um, in the sleep field, we call this process S. Essentially, what this is it's that kind of buildup that we get throughout the day that leads to this like physical pressure that we feel to sleep. And so, if you've ever stayed up later than usual, or there's times where you just didn't get enough sleep the night before, and if you like think about that feeling where like your eyelids are really heavy, where you feel like you just can't physically keep them open anymore, that's that homeostatic sleep pressure that really drives us to fall asleep. And so, really, what's happening is there's a particular kind of buildup of this neurotransmitter over the course of the day. And so, you can see in the figure, if we have a normal day, we wake up, that sleep pressure builds over time. And then when we sleep, that sleep pressure starts to dissipate and go away. And then when we wake up, it starts to build again. You can see if you like don't sleep, that pressure just continues to build and build and build. Similarly, like if you take a nap, you see a little bit of that sleep pressure dissipate, although not entirely. You really need like a full night of sleep to be able to fully kind of alleviate that pressure. We do see that there's age differences in the sleep pressure. And so, in particular, kids tend to build this up much faster than we do as adults. It's usually around the age of 12 or so, we start to see this build up more slowly. So, prior to that, it tends to be really strong. That's why, like, one of the reasons why younger kids need to nap throughout the day. And then it's also like, I don't know if any of you guys have kids of your own or think about like young babies or young kids. Like my daughter falls asleep in the weirdest, most uncomfortable looking positions sometimes. And I know that's the case for a lot of kids. And it's because that sleep pressure is so heavy for them that like once it hits, it's like they have to sleep and that drive is really, really strong. So we do see some age differences there. And just kind of like a fun fact, like this is one of the reasons why caffeine works because it actually blocks the receptors to be able to feel that sleep pressure. So that's why, like, if you drink coffee, you might temporarily feel more awake, but then as soon as the caffeine wears off, that sleep pressure has continued to build. So you almost feel like more tired than when you started. So the other thing that drives our sleep, other than that sleep pressure that's building up throughout the day, is what we call process C, which is our circadian rhythm. And that's essentially just this kind of like internal biological clock that we all have. It follows a roughly 24-hour cycle, although it's not exactly 24 hours. So, for example, people who are like night owls, they tend to have a slightly longer circadian rhythm. So it's closer to like maybe 25 hours than that 24. And this internal biological clock we have actually regulates a lot of our body. So it regulates a lot of our organ systems, regulates things like our metabolism, for example. But it also regulates our sleep. And so, one thing in particular is that it really drives when our body releases the hormone melatonin, which is the hormone that makes us sleepy. And so what we tend to see is that at certain points during the day, so usually in the evening, we start to see this like rise in terms of like how much melatonin we have in our body. And then it reaches a certain threshold where then we start to feel sleepy. So that's one thing that drives us to actually feel sleepy at certain times of day, kind of regardless of whether or not you've had enough sleep or you have that sleep pressure. So it's independent than that homeostatic sleep pressure. Now that's kind of like an internal process that's happening like underneath our skin within our bodies. But one thing with our circadian rhythms is they can be kind of entrained or trained by our environment around us. And so in the sleep field, we refer to anything that influences our circadian rhythm as a Zeitgeber, which is just German for like a time giver. And essentially, this is anything that communicates to our body that it's a certain time of day. So a really big one for melatonin is light. And so really it's just like, is the sun out? And if it is, that means it's daytime. If the sun is not out, then maybe it's time to sleep. And that communicates to our body what we should be doing. That's especially a challenge in Montana since we have such wide swings between lots of daylight in the summer and not a lot of daylight in the winter. Um, Things like artificial light can kind of mimic sunlight too, which can kind of trick our body into thinking it's daytime when it's not. But really, there's a lot of different things that can tell our body what time of day it is. So things like social activity, eating, all of those things kind of give our body information that then tells us like what time of day is it and should we be sleepy or not. And then as I mentioned, right, so there are some differences in this internal clock. So we certainly have some people who are more like night owls and some people who tend to be more the morning lark, who are kind of like up early and ready to go. I personally cannot relate to that, but I know that's certainly something that yeah, we have kind of those individual differences between us. So those are really the 2 factors that drive us to sleep. But one thing I'll point out too is that when people are sleeping, that sleep isn't the same over the course of the entire night. And so what we can actually do is we can look at what's happening within the body and within the brain when people are sleeping. So in our lab here at MSU, we do something called polysomnography, which looks a little bit like this, where we attach electrodes to the head and the face. And try to make it as comfortable as possible for people to sleep. And what that does is it allows us to tell us what's actually happening while people are sleeping. And so the information that we get allows us to look at different brain waves, which allows us to determine what stage of sleep people are in. And so what we see is that we cycle between 2 main types of sleep. So non-rapid eye movement sleep and rapid eye movement sleep. Um, and so the figure with all of the squiggly lines that shows what different brain activity might look like at these different stages. Stage 1 tends to be really brief. It tends to just be this like transition between being awake and sleeping, usually just maybe a couple minutes. This is where, our eyes start to close, our bodies start to slow down. This is where if you've ever had that like falling sensation where you jolt awake, which is totally normal. That's usually happening during this transition stage. Then stage 2, this is a stage where we see a lot of theta waves where things tend to slow even more. We also see these really unique patterns in our brain activity during this stage, something called like a sleep spindle and then a K complex. The figure there, you can see that where it gets like really rapid. That's an example of a sleep spindle. And we're still learning in the sleep field, like all of the purposes of some of these different signatures that we see. But there is some evidence that things like sleep spindles and K complexes are related to things like learning. So when people learn things during the day, if they have more sleep spindles at night, they tend to remember them better in the morning. It's also linked with things like IQ as well. So we think it might be important for like cognitive functioning and a lot of things that kids are doing throughout the day at school. Then we have stage 3 sleep. Our brain waves get really slow. Our heart rate is really slow at this time. Our breathing slows down. And this is a period of sleep where we are doing a lot of restoration and repair. So things like growth hormones, for example, are being released during the stage. This is where, if we're recovering from an illness, for example, stage 3 sleep is really important for this. And then we have rapid eye movement sleep. And the interesting thing about rapid eye movement sleep is actually that our brain activity looks really similar to how it does when we're awake. And so we tend to be very active during rapid eye movement sleep in terms of like neurological activity. Our eyes are moving during rapid eye movement sleep, which is how it gets its name. But during this time, our bodies tend to be paralyzed. So not a lot of physical activity, but there's a lot going on internally. And we think this is when a lot of our dreaming tends to occur. And if you look at the figure on the right, you'll see we kind of cycle through these different sleep stages throughout the night. And if you notice, it's not really uniform across the night. So the first part of the night, you can see like a lot of our time when we're sleeping is spent in that slow wave sleep or that stage 3 sleep, where we're seeing again kind of this like everything's slowing down. There's a lot more restoration and repair happening. And then the second part of the night, what we see is a lot more rapid eye movement sleep. And so the reason why this is important is if you have somebody who's not sleeping as much as they should, it's not just the total number of hours of sleep they're getting, but it might also depend on like when they're losing that sleep. Like, are they staying up later or are they waking up earlier than they need to? Because that's going to impact the type of sleep that they're getting. And, again, we think these different sleep stages might serve some slightly different purposes or might serve some different roles for us. So the daytime effects of that might look a little bit different. So that's kind of the background of like what sleep is and what it looks like and what leads us to sleep. Um, and I want to just talk a little bit about what like healthy sleep actually looks like. Because oftentimes when we think of like, is someone sleeping okay, we tend to just think of like the number of hours. So we really focus on sleep duration, which is very important. And of course, that's something that varies quite a bit with age. So the figure there kind of shows the recommendations for these different age groups. So for kids in grade school, like 9 to 12 hours of sleep is kind of the range that we look for. For teens, 8 to 10 hours is more so what we look for as well. So duration is certainly part of it, but there's other aspects of our sleep that seem to be just as important sometimes for how we function during the day. So one aspect of this is what we call regularity. So just like, are you sleeping on a regular schedule? So for example, are you like waking up around the same time each night or each morning and going to bed around the same time each evening? And generally what we want to see is that you're within like an hour or two each day and we're not having these big swings, which is sometimes a challenge, especially for kids who maybe are waking up really early to get to school in the morning and are not sleeping enough during the week and then they're sleeping in on the weekends. We see these kind of big swings take place. And that seems to be kind of regardless of the number of hours you sleep, that seems to be important for things like mental health, behavioral problems, brain development, and things like that. Um, Also just like how satisfied you feel with your sleep seems to be important too. So kind of regardless of like how long you slept or if you're sleeping on a regular schedule, um, when people just say like, I don't feel like I slept well enough, or you just feel like you didn't sleep very well, that seems to be important and impacts our daytime functioning too. So kind of that subjective perception is important, kind of regardless of like what's actually like what we can measure in terms of like how long people are actually sleeping. And then how alert people are throughout the day. So are you able to go through your day fairly alert? Are you kind of dozing off or taking naps throughout the day? Also the timing of sleep. So are you going to bed around the right time that would allow you to do the things you need to do when it's time to be awake? And then something that we call sleep efficiency too. And this is essentially, we tend to talk about this in terms of like a percentage. So like if you take the total amount of time that you're in bed, like laying in bed, how much of that time are you actually asleep? Or are you spending a lot of time like laying awake, not sleeping in bed? And so that could be somebody who maybe is having a hard time falling asleep. So is just laying awake, struggling to fall asleep, or someone who wakes up in the middle of the night and has a hard time getting back to sleep. That's when we might see someone with this like lower sleep efficiency. And that tends to be something that we see a lot in like people who struggle with insomnia, for example. So typically we want to see like more than 85% of time, like not, actually sleeping. So that's when we think about healthy sleep, that's really what we're looking for. But that being said, there's a lot of people who are not getting enough sleep or not getting adequate sleep. The figure on the right, so this is from data from adults across the country, and it shows kind of on the county level the percentage of people who are not getting enough sleep in these different counties. So you can see like some of the darker red colors, it's like 40 to 60%, so really fairly high people who are not getting enough sleep each night. You can see throughout Montana, there's some variability. Some counties are doing better than others, but even the like counties that are that lighter yellow, it's still like 20 to 30%, which is a lot of people who are not getting enough sleep. So this is something that a lot of people are struggling with. And kind of beyond, again, just like how much are you sleeping? There's also a large number of people who have sleep disorders too, and that number is rising. So insomnia is a really common one. Sleep apnea and restless leg syndrome are two of the other more common ones as well. And in children too, and in teens in particular, delayed sleep phase is another one that we see that tends to be fairly common. About 10% of teens have delayed sleep phase disorder. So this is something that seems to be increasing over time. It's estimated that it's going to be about 100 million by 2050. And kind of I mean, that's a really large number, but beyond that too, what we see is that a lot of people who have sleep disorders often go undiagnosed and untreated as well. It might be that they don't necessarily know that they have these symptoms that are problematic, or a lot of sleep problems we tend to kind of normalize. We tend to think that like not getting enough sleep is just like a part of life. And so oftentimes people might not be seeking out support for that, or they don't have adequate support available, or medical providers maybe that know what signs to recognize or things to ask about. And so for kids and teens in particular, I think schools are really kind of a great place where these things could be recognized that maybe you're getting missed in healthcare settings. And so, kind of thinking about just this being a pervasive problem in general, we do also see that kids and teens also tend to struggle with sleep more. So for kids, it really kind of depends on the particular, data set. We're looking at percentages, but between like 30 and 50% is a good number of kids who aren't getting enough sleep. It's around the range that we typically see. And for teens, it's anywhere between 70 to 90%. So most teens are not getting enough sleep. And so part of the reason I'll talk a little bit more about sleep in teenagers, and this tends to be the case for middle school and high school in particular. I'll talk more about this because there's some pretty well-established reasons for why this number is so high. So the teenage years, they've been referred to as kind of like a perfect storm for poor sleep. And so what tends to happen right around the time that kids go through puberty, so as I mentioned, that homeostatic sleep pressure tends to slow down. So that drive to sleep gets a little bit lower. But at the same time, there's also this biological change that teens go through where that release of melatonin in the body that makes us feel sleepy starts to become delayed. And it ends up by about the mid-teenage years, it ends up being delayed by about 2 hours in terms of when it releases in the body. So it's actually like physically harder for teens to fall asleep at earlier times. And this is also usually around the same time, teens are starting high school, where high schools tend to start a lot earlier than they're used to, and oftentimes much earlier than what would be needed for them to be able to get adequate sleep. And this is also happening at the same time that kids are dealing with a lot of other pressures too. So this is around the time that they have more freedom over when they go to bed, which depending on the kid is fine, but for a lot of kids, not so much. There's a lot more academic pressures. Oftentimes this is when kids are getting their own devices, so there might be more screen time, and they have a lot of social pressures going on as well. And so there's kind of this combination of these like societal pressures we have with these biological changes just kind of co-occurring at the same time. And this creates this what we call like social jet lag, as I mentioned, where you have this like shortened opportunity for sleep during the week where teens are not sleeping enough. And then on the weekends, they have a chance to sleep in, which a lot of them do. And then you have this like irregular sleep schedule in addition to not sleeping enough on most days too. And so that's, data just thinking about like kids and teens as a whole. But we've done some work here at MSU on sleep in youth in Montana as well. So we did a study where we looked at teens, so between 10 to 17 years old across the entire state. And we found that about a quarter of those kids had symptoms that were consistent with at least one sleep disorder, which wasn't too surprising. That's like pretty on par with what we see around the country. But one thing that we did find is that the majority of those kids were not receiving any medical care for those sleep disorders, and a lot of them had never received a diagnosis. When we talked to parents about the symptoms and said this is actually consistent with insomnia or sleep apnea, a lot of people had no idea that it wasn't something that was like normal or typical. And then kind of beyond that too, we asked a lot of different questions about just different information people had gotten about sleep across the state. And almost half of the families were reporting, or at least half of the teens were reporting that they had never had a healthcare provider ask them about their sleep. It's certainly been asked about other things like drug use and nutrition and exercise, and but a lot of them had said that no one has really asked them about their sleep, which is potentially possibly why some of these symptoms have gone unnoticed for many of these youth. Um, and this is something that it's certainly not a number we want to see. We want to know that kids are getting information and resources when they need it. But there have been other studies across the country looking at different healthcare providers and pediatricians, and about 50% of pediatricians will say that they don't ask about sleep because they don't know how to answer their patients' questions that come up. Simply because training for medical providers in terms of sleep tends to be fairly limited, despite the fact that sleep problems are common in so many different physical health conditions. It's something where the training has kind of lagged behind. So this is something that I think a lot of kids across Montana, a lot of kids are struggling with it, and also might not even realize that it's something that they're struggling with, and they might not have the resources or the support to handle it. So again, that's why I think schools potentially are a great avenue to be able to recognize these things when they come up and provide resources to families. And kind of beyond that too, so like people have tracked and the government has been tracking sleep across the country. It's been like getting good sleep has been a part of like the Healthy People Initiative from the CDC for decades now. And despite that, it continues to get worse. More and more people tend to sleep less. And if we look at kids who are not getting enough sleep, if you actually kind of break it down based on where people live, it's more of these non-metropolitan areas where we see that sleep tends to be getting worse, more so than other areas of the country. So for kids living in more rural areas, that potentially could be more of a risk. And we've done some studies in our lab too, looking at just some factors that might be unique, again, to kids in Montana or areas similar to Montana. One thing we looked at, I had a student in my lab who was really interested in this idea of altitude and how that can change kind of our underlying physiology while we're sleeping. And we looked at, again, teens across the state who were living at different levels of altitude. And we found that at higher altitude, people actually reported needing more sleep to feel well rested. And so we already have a really large percentage of people not getting enough sleep, but that might be especially the case in some of these areas with a higher altitude too. So if that's an area where you live, that might be something to kind of keep in mind, that those standard recommendations we have might not necessarily fit everybody, and it might be higher for some. Okay, so I'll just touch really brief on some different consequences or signs of inadequate sleep, just to kind of know some things that you might recognize for kids who aren't sleeping enough. So as I mentioned before, so sleep impacts almost every single area of our daytime functioning. It's really hard to find things that aren't related to sleep. Actually, most things are, but some that are a little bit more, I would say, relevant and things that are especially important are things like increased risky behavior. I think this is really relevant for like teens who already tend to be a little bit riskier on average than other ages. Um, we also see increased risk of accidents and injuries too, which experiencing those sorts of things just increase like risk for trauma for kids as well if they're experiencing those or their friends are experiencing those. Um, so one example of that is if you have stayed up just a few hours later than you usually do, your reaction time is actually like the equivalent of if you were like legally drunk. And so if you think about a teen maybe who's like out late driving, that of course is going to increase that risk. We also see increased risk for chronic disease as people get older. Those kind of negative effects of poor sleep build up over time. Kids are more likely to get sick more often, and we engage in poor health behaviors too when we're tired. I mean, if you think about the last time you didn't get a good night's sleep, like it's not really, for me, like I don't feel like going to the gym and spending an hour making a really healthy meal after that. That's usually not what we want to do. We tend to crave more like high fat foods, like saturated fats, and we tend to just be less motivated overall. We also see impaired cognitive functioning, and as I mentioned before, too, like altered neurological development. And we also see a lot of difficulties with attention sometimes for kids who aren't getting enough sleep. Um, so in particular, like a lot of I shouldn't say a lot, but for some kids who are experiencing sleep loss, we see kind of a subset of them that actually show not kind of this like, low energy behaviors, but actually more like ADHD hyperactivity type behaviors. And so that's one way that those kind of like signs of poor sleep can manifest for some kids. And again, it plays a role in things like learning and memory as well. So a lot of ways that this could be impacting kids in the classroom. Decreased energy and motivation for some. Then socially too, we tend to be perceived more negatively by others when we don't get enough sleep. We tend to get more conflict with others as well. We tend to feel more hostile. Um, People are more likely to do things like lie and cheat when they aren't sleeping well as well. So more antisocial behaviors and fewer pro social behaviors, and then increased risk for mental health difficulties too. And so with sleep and mental health, this is, in my lab, this is really where we focus a lot of our efforts is looking at these connections and understanding why sleep is connected to mental health. We see that sleep contributes to the development of mental health disorders. And also if someone already is struggling with their mental health, it can make that worse as well. And we see that sleep problems are present in nearly like in every type of psychological disorder. So things like depression, anxiety, PTSD, bipolar, substance use, suicidality. And it's kind of like this chicken or the egg question. Like, what came first? Is it that you're struggling with your sleep? And then because of that, you tend to then struggle with your mental health, or are you having a hard time sleeping because of your mental health? It's certainly a little bit of both. But if you follow people over time and kind of track their symptoms, more often than not, it's usually that the sleep problems tend to start first for most. So we've done some studies looking at like why this is the case. Like if you have a kid who's struggling with their sleep over the course of like weeks and months or years for some kids, why does this lead to the onset of like mental health problems later? And one reason we think for this is that it tends to affect how we like respond to things emotionally the next day. We have a harder time responding to certain emotions. Like we might have kind of elevated reactions to negative things that happen. We tend to have more like blunted reactions to like good things that happen. And they've done some studies too showing that like, we might react more strongly to negative things, but then the connections between like the emotion centers of our brain and kind of like the top down, like emotional control centers of our brain, there's a disconnect between them when we're tired. So we're feeling things really strongly, but that ability to control those feelings is not there in the same way that it would be otherwise. In our lab too, we've also looked at how sleep might impact just the day-to-day social experiences kids are getting. We know having like positive peer relationships is so important and critical for kids, especially as they're entering like middle school and high school. And so there's some studies showing that sleep quality is associated with things like loneliness. And we did a study too where we looked at kids within a middle school, and we were able to map out actually like the whole social network in this particular middle school. And so that one figure, you can see all those little dots and those lines that kind of look like a web. That's the social network of this middle school. So each dot represents a single kid, and then each line shows a connection between those kids. So we went into the school and we asked them like, who do you spend time with and who do you enjoy spending time with? And so we were able to figure out like who is friends with who. We were also able to see like, so how many friends people nominated and then how many people nominated that person. And then we could see reciprocated friendships too, because they weren't always reciprocated. And what we found is that the kids who had high levels of sleep disturbances versus the kids who weren't reporting any sleep problems, they had half as many friendships as the kids who were okay. And so you can see in that figure kind of that decrease as you get to those higher levels of sleep disturbances. And for a middle schooler, like half as many friends, that's a really big deal. And that was something that was related to their sleep. Okay, so I'll just briefly touch on again how to kind of identify different sleep problems and then just some tips for better sleep too. So some signs of insufficient sleep. So as I mentioned, like it's not always maybe immediately apparent that sleep could be a potential issue, but one way that we see it play out for a lot of kids is if they have any sort of psychological difficulties going on. I think it's there's certainly reason then to inquire a little bit more about their sleep. So we tend to see some kids might be irritable or just a lack of motivation or just kind of like blunted affect, like not really responding as much as they should or more than they should. We can see it go in both directions. And then, as I mentioned, like hyperactivity and inattention symptoms can be common too. Some other things too is like if kids are like needing an alarm clock to wake up, that usually means that they're not kind of letting their body naturally do so, which usually means they're curtailing their sleep and cutting it a little bit short. Or falling asleep really quickly too is another sign. It's certainly within the realm of normal to spend 10, 15 minutes trying to fall asleep. Usually like 30 minutes or more, that starts to be more of a problem and more indicative of like insomnia. But sometimes I'll talk to kids and kids will be like, I'm a great sleeper. I lay down and I go to sleep right away. Um, and kids' perception of that isn't always totally accurate, but like if that is what's happening where they're hitting the pillow and falling asleep, it's actually a sign usually that they're not getting enough sleep because they're so tired that as soon as they're in bed, they're falling asleep almost immediately. So usually we kind of want like a happy range. Again, like 10, 15 minutes is usually what we look for. Um, Kids that like have a high chance of like dozing off. So like while they're sitting in class, for example, or who take regular naps, this is usually a sign they're not getting enough sleep at night. Um, and one thing I'll point out too is that like the time that kids are spending in bed does not always equal how much time they're actually sleeping. And so this is one that comes up a lot where parents might say like, well, they go to bed at this time and they wake up this time, so that should be 9 hours. But in reality, there's going to be that time that's not spent sleeping too, where people wake up a little bit throughout the night, which is completely normal, or it takes a little bit of time to fall asleep. Usually I say adding like 30 minutes to an hour to those sleep times will get you the right amount of sleep then if people are sleeping well. So here's just a couple tips for getting better sleep. We call this like sleep hygiene. So kind of like taking care of your sleep. So keeping a regular sleep schedule, again, kind of keeping times consistent, keeping a regular relaxing bedtime routine, controlling that light exposure at night and then in the morning too. So being around bright lights in the morning and then dim lights at night, that helps kind of regulate that circadian rhythm. Again, that's harder in Montana depending on the time of year. The things like blackout curtains are great, or having lights on in the home could be helpful too. Avoiding things that are stressful before bed, limiting caffeine exposure if you can, or keeping that to the first part of the day if you can. And then keeping the sleep environment comfortable too, and just no clutter around that's going to be stressful. Keeping the bedroom dimly lit, and then keeping the temperature around 67 to 69 degrees is usually what's recommended. Um, and that's because our temperature naturally dips, and so then we're not kind of working against the temperature in the room too. And that's another one that we've found has come up a lot in Montana since so many people don't have air conditioning. And in the summer, it can be, depending on where you are, it can get super hot. So this is a really common complaint we've heard about kids across the state, that the temperature just isn't, it's hard for them to sleep sometimes. And then another one is what we call stimulus control too. So that's essentially like if you're just laying awake in bed, so having a hard time falling asleep or staying asleep, what you're actually doing is kind of teaching your brain that like bed is a place that I lay awake, and we learn those associations. And so just controlling that and, not sending a kid to bed too early where they're not sleepy yet can kind of prevent that. That could lead to like insomnia symptoms in the long run. Yeah. And so I have some resources here that I think are great things to check out if you are looking for some of these resources. The American Academy of Sleep Medicine in particular has a lot of different options. There's like a bedtime calculator you can share with parents. They also have like lesson plans and posters that you can, they'll send you, and you can print them out to put up around school, or pass out to families as well. They have a lot of really great resources there. And then the National Sleep Foundation and the Society for Behavioral Sleep Medicine also is a great resource. So if you have a family who is really struggling with sleep, like the Society for Behavioral Sleep Medicine, they have a list of providers that you could check out if you want to provide some recommendations to them. And then this baby sleep website, this was developed by a handful of sleep researchers across the world. And some of it focuses on babies specifically, but they have some resources for older kids as well. And so this is they've got lots of great articles and just lots of great tips for parents who are kind of like in the trenches and have no idea what to do. So I think this is a great one too that you can always recommend for families.